On August 14, 1971, a Saturday evening, a man named Gerald Perkins sat in his living room in Dayton, Ohio, watching Bonanza on NBC. Gerald was 41 years old. He had a mortgage at 7%, a savings account at Winters National Bank that paid 4.5% interest, and a $20 bill in his wallet that, according to the United States government, could be exchanged for approximately 1/18 of an ounce of gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The $20 bill was a Federal Reserve note, and the words printed on it constituted a contract. The contract said the dollar was worth a specific, measurable quantity of a physical substance that had held value for 5,000 years. Gerald did not know that by the time Bonanza ended, that contract would be broken, not renegotiated, not amended, broken by a president in a room with 15 men on a weekend without a single vote in Congress. This is a story about the money in your wallet, not metaphorically, literally. The bills you carried to the grocery store this week, the direct deposit that hit your bank account last Friday, the number on your mortgage statement, every one of those figures is denominated in a currency that, as of August 15, 1971, is backed by nothing except a promise. Before that date, a dollar was a receipt for gold. After that date, a dollar was a piece of paper that the government promised to honor. The distinction sounds academic. It is not. It is the single most consequential financial event of your lifetime, even if it happened before you were born, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly how it works and exactly what it costs you every year. The forensic record on the Nixon shock, that is the name economists gave to it, and the word shock is not accidental, begins not in 1971 but in 1944, in a hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. In July of 1944, while American soldiers were dying on the beaches of Normandy, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their task was to design the financial architecture of the post-war world. The previous system, the gold standard, in which each country's currency was directly convertible to gold, had collapsed during the Great Depression. Countries had devalued their currencies competitively, imposed tariffs, and withdrawn into economic isolation. The result was the worst economic catastrophe in modern history, followed by the worst military catastrophe in human history. The delegates at Bretton Woods were trying to make sure it never happened again. The system they designed was elegant and, for 27 years, remarkably effective. It was also the product of a specific political moment that will never return. The dominant figure at Bretton Woods was Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. White's British counterpart was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, a man whose theories had reshaped how governments understood money and employment. Keynes wanted a neutral international currency called the Bancor, managed by a neutral international institution. White wanted the dollar. They argued for 3 weeks. White won. He won because the United States had the gold, the military, and the economy to enforce whatever system it chose. Keynes returned to London exhausted and died less than 2 years later. The system that emerged was not the best theoretical design. It was the design that the most powerful country in the room demanded. White, it was later discovered, had been passing information to the Soviet Union. He was not a spy in the conventional sense. He appears to have believed that cooperation between the US and USSR was desirable, but the irony is structural. The architect of American financial hegemony was simultaneously providing economic intelligence to America's primary competitor. He died of a heart attack in 1948, 3 days after testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The system he built outlived him by 23 years. Here is how it worked. The United States dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other currency in the system would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The French franc, the British pound, the German mark, the Japanese yen, all of them were defined in terms of dollars, and the dollar was defined in terms of gold. If Germany wanted to know what its mark was worth, it looked at the dollar. If it wanted to know what the dollar was worth, it looked at gold. The chain was simple, transparent, and anchored in something physical. The system worked because of a single guarantee. Any foreign government could walk into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, present US dollars, and receive gold at $35 per ounce. Not a promise of gold, not a certificate redeemable for gold at some future date. Actual, physical gold bars, pulled from the vault beneath Maiden Lane in Lower Manhattan. The vault held, at its peak, approximately 26% of all the monetary gold ever mined in human history. This is the detail that connects to your bank account. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. government could not print unlimited dollars. Every dollar in circulation was, in theory, backed by gold. If the government printed too many dollars, foreign governments would notice that the dollar was losing value, present their dollars at the Fed, and drain the gold reserve. The gold reserve acted as a governor, a physical limit on how much money the government could create. If you held dollars, you held a claim on gold. If you held a claim on gold, your money could not be inflated away by a government that wanted to spend more than it earned. Think about what that means for the money you hold today. Under the current system, the one that replaced Bretton Woods, there is no governor. The Federal Reserve can create dollars without limit. The only constraint is the Fed's own judgment about how much inflation is acceptable. In 1971, the U.S. money supply, measured by M2, was approximately $685 billion. As of early 2025, it is approximately $21.2 trillion. That is a 30-fold increase. The U.S. population in the same period grew by approximately 60%. 30 times more money for 60% more people. The math is not complicated. Each dollar buys less. Every year. By design. This is a story about the money in your wallet. Not metaphorically. Literally. The bills you carried to the grocery store this week, the direct deposit that hit your bank account last Friday, the number on your mortgage statement, every one of those figures is denominated in a currency that, as of August 15, 1971, is backed by nothing except a promise. Before that date, a dollar was a receipt for gold. After that date, a dollar was a piece of paper that the government promised to honor. The distinction sounds academic. It is not. It is the single most consequential financial event of your lifetime, even if it happened before you were born. And by the end of this video you will understand exactly how it works and exactly what it costs you every year. The dominant figure at Bretton Woods was Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. White's British counterpart was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, a man whose theories had reshaped how governments understood money and employment. Keynes wanted a neutral international currency called the Bancor, managed by a neutral international institution. White wanted the dollar. They argued for 3 weeks. White won. He won because the United States had the gold, the military, and the economy to enforce whatever system it chose. Keynes returned to London exhausted and died less than 2 years later. The system that emerged was not the best theoretical design. It was the design that the most powerful country in the room demanded. But in 1944, nobody imagined the system would break. The United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. The U.S. economy was half of global GDP. American factories were intact while European and Japanese factories were rubble. Nobody else could challenge the dollar because nobody else had the gold, the factories, or the military to back an alternative. The dollar was the world's currency because the United States was the world's economy. The system began to crack in 1958. By the late 1950s, Europe and Japan had rebuilt. German factories were producing cars and machinery. Japanese factories were producing electronics and steel. The Marshall Plan, which had cost the United States approximately $13 billion between 1948 and 1952, roughly $170 billion in today's money, had been spectacularly successful. Too successful from the perspective of the Bretton Woods system. Here is the mechanism. As European and Japanese economies grew, they began exporting goods to the United States. Americans bought Volkswagens and Toyotas and Sony televisions. The dollars they paid for those goods flowed overseas. European and Japanese central banks accumulated dollars. And some of those central banks began to wonder, how much gold does the United States actually have? The answer, increasingly, was not enough. The United States was running persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it was receiving. At the same time, the U.S. government was spending at a rate that made the gold peg unsustainable. The Korean War cost approximately $340 billion in today's money. The Vietnam War, by 1971, had cost approximately $840 billion. The Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, federal housing, added hundreds of billions more. Every dollar spent was a dollar that might eventually come back to the Fed's gold window. A Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified the problem in 1959. He called it a dilemma, and it bears his name to this day. Triffin's dilemma states that the country whose currency serves as the global reserve must run persistent deficits to supply the world with enough of its currency to facilitate trade. But persistent deficits undermine confidence in that currency, which eventually destroys the system. The global reserve currency is required to do two contradictory things simultaneously: be abundant enough to grease world trade and scarce enough to retain its value. Cannot do both forever. Triffin told Congress the system would collapse. Congress listened politely and did nothing. The man who forced the issue was not an American. He was French. Charles de Gaulle, President of France, war hero, and a man who regarded American monetary dominance with the suspicion of a chess grandmaster watching an opponent palm a piece, held a press conference at the Élysée Palace on February 4, 1965. Speaking to 300 journalists in a room lit by chandeliers that had survived 2 world wars, de Gaulle declared that the Bretton Woods system was an exorbitant privilege that allowed the United States to buy real goods from the rest of the world by printing paper. The phrase exorbitant privilege was coined by de Gaulle's economic advisor, Jacques Rueff, a man who had been warning about the instability of the dollar system since the 1950s. Rueff's argument was precise. The United States was running deficits, flooding the world with dollars, and spending those dollars on wars and social programs it could not afford. The only reason the system survived was that other countries were willing to hold dollars instead of demanding gold. Rueff predicted that this willingness would end. He was right. De Gaulle did not stop at rhetoric. Between 1965 and 1966, France converted approximately $300 million into gold at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The French government sent an actual warship, a destroyer, to New York Harbor to transport the gold back to Paris. The image was deliberate. De Gaulle wanted the world to see that he was literally removing gold from American custody. He was calling the bluff. Other nations followed, quietly. Germany, which depended on American military protection against the Soviet Union, could not openly challenge the dollar. But the Bundesbank reduced its dollar holdings and increased its gold reserves incrementally, the way a careful guest steals silverware one fork at a time. Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands did the same. By 1970, the gold window at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was processing withdrawal requests from a dozen countries simultaneously. The tellers at Maiden Lane, the people who physically moved the gold from one cage to another in the vault 5 stories below street level, were working overtime, and the bluff was collapsing. In 1945, the United States held approximately $20 billion in gold reserves, roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold. By 1960, that number had fallen to approximately $17.8 billion. By 1968, it was $10.9 billion. By August 1971, it was $10.2 billion. Meanwhile, foreign claims on American gold, the dollars held by foreign central banks that could theoretically be redeemed, had risen to approximately $40 billion. For every dollar of gold in the vault, there were $4 of claims against it. The mathematics were identical to a bank run. The system worked as long as everybody believed in it. The moment enough people tried to withdraw, there was not enough gold to go around, and countries were trying to withdraw. In the first week of August 1971, Britain asked the United States to convert $3 billion into gold. It was an extraordinary request, nearly 30% of the remaining reserve in a single transaction. The British were not being aggressive. They were being prudent. They could see the numbers. They knew the gold was running out. They wanted to be among the first to collect, not the last. Britain was not alone. Switzerland had withdrawn $50 million in gold the previous month. France had been withdrawing steadily since de Gaulle's press conference. Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, country after country was quietly converting dollars to gold, the way depositors walk calmly to the teller window at a bank they no longer trust. Nobody was running yet, but everybody was walking faster. The crisis had a precedent. In 1968, 3 years before the Nixon shock, the London Gold Pool, a consortium of 8 central banks that cooperated to keep the market price of gold at $35 per ounce, had collapsed. The pool had been selling gold from its reserves onto the open market to suppress the price. But demand from private buyers, who correctly perceived that the dollar was overvalued relative to gold, was draining the pool faster than it could be replenished. In March 1968, the pool lost 400 tons of gold in a single week. 400 tons, roughly 3% of all the monetary gold in existence, and the central banks surrendered. They created a two-tier system, $35 per ounce for governments, market price for everyone else. The market price immediately rose to $43. The gap between the official price and the market price was the measured distance between what the U.S. government said the dollar was worth and what the world actually believed. Paul Volcker, then the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs, later the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had been tracking the gold drain for months. His analysis was clear. At the current rate of withdrawals, the United States would run out of gold entirely within weeks, not months, weeks. Volcker prepared a series of policy options and presented them to Treasury Secretary John Connally. The dominant figure at Bretton Woods was Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. White's British counterpart was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, a man whose theories had reshaped how governments understood money and employment. Keynes wanted a neutral international currency called the Bancor, managed by a neutral international institution. White wanted the dollar. They argued for 3 weeks. White won. He won because the United States had the gold, the military, and the economy to enforce whatever system it chose. Keynes returned to London exhausted and died less than 2 years later. The system that emerged was not the best theoretical design. It was the design that the most powerful country in the room demanded. Paul Volcker, then the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs, later the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had been tracking the gold drain for months. His analysis was clear. At the current rate of withdrawals, the United States would run out of gold entirely within weeks. Not months, weeks. Volcker prepared a series of policy options and presented them to Treasury Secretary John Connally. Connally was a Texan, a former governor, a Democrat serving in a Republican administration, and a man who understood power with the instincts of a rattlesnake. He had no training in international economics. He had no interest in international economics. What he had was an understanding that the United States was about to be humiliated, and that a president facing re-election in 14 months could not afford humiliation. Connally took Volcker's options to Nixon. Nixon, who understood neither gold nor monetary theory but understood political survival with a precision that bordered on genius, made a decision. He called a meeting. On Friday, August 13, 1971, Nixon summoned 15 men to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. The list included Connally, Volcker, Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Herbert Stein, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers George Shultz, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and 10 others. No members of Congress were invited. No senators. No representatives of the press. The meeting was classified. The men arrived by helicopter. They were told not to make phone calls. They were told not to leave. The White House switchboard was instructed to deny that anything unusual was happening. A Navy steward served steaks and cocktails. Connally held court at dinner, regaling the economists with stories about Texas politics. The atmosphere, according to Volcker's later account, was oddly festive, as though the men understood they were making history and wanted to enjoy the gravity of it. Burns sat apart, smoking his pipe, saying little. Volcker had prepared 3 options. Option 1. Defend the gold peg by raising interest rates sharply, inducing a recession to reduce imports and restore the balance of payments. This was the orthodox solution, the one that every economics textbook recommended, and it was politically impossible 14 months before an election. Option 2. Devalue the dollar against gold, raising the official price from $35 to, say, $38 per ounce. This would reduce the pressure but not eliminate it, and it would admit to the world that the dollar was not worth what the government had been claiming. Option 3. Close the gold window entirely and let the dollar float. Find its value on the open market, backed by nothing except the productive capacity of the American economy. Connally advocated option 3 with the conviction of a man who had been shot in the chest during the Kennedy assassination and survived. Burns argued against it with the conviction of a man who had spent his career studying the history of monetary collapses. Nixon chose Connally. In the transcript of the Camp David meetings, partially declassified, Nixon is recorded saying that the United States could not let the speculators dictate American economic policy. He used the language of war. The enemy was not inflation or trade deficits. The enemy was humiliation. For 2 days, 15 men in a lodge in the Maryland woods designed a new financial architecture for the entire world. No foreign government was consulted. No international body was notified. The International Monetary Fund learned about the decision from watching television. Here is what they decided. The United States would close the gold window. Effective immediately, the Federal Reserve would no longer exchange dollars for gold at any price. The $35 per ounce guarantee that had anchored the global monetary system for 27 years would simply stop. Every foreign central bank that held dollars, expecting them to be redeemable, would discover that those dollars were redeemable for nothing. Arthur Burns opposed the decision. Burns was a conservative economist who understood that closing the gold window would remove the last physical constraint on government spending. He argued that without the gold anchor, there would be no limit on how many dollars the Federal Reserve could create. He warned that this would lead to inflation. Nixon overruled him. Connally persuaded Nixon that the gold window had to close because the alternative, running out of gold entirely, would be worse. Connally was right about the politics. Burns was right about the economics. The package included two other elements. First, a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States, the first peacetime wage and price controls in American history. Second, a 10% surcharge on all imports, essentially a tariff designed to punish countries that were undervaluing their currencies against the dollar. The package was designed by Volcker but sold by Connally. Connally's famous assessment of the world's reaction was 7 words. The dollar is our currency, but your problem. Gerald Perkins, the GM foreman in Dayton, heard the president's voice replace the familiar opening of the Western. Nixon sat behind his desk in the Oval Office and spoke for approximately 18 minutes. He described the challenge of peace and the challenge of prosperity. He used the phrase new economic policy. He did not use the phrase closing the gold window. He did not explain that the dollar was no longer convertible to gold. He said America would not be a hostage in the hands of international money speculators. The phrasing was deliberate. It framed the decision as defensive, patriotic, necessary. It was the monetary equivalent of a controlled demolition presented as a renovation. The stock market, on Monday, responded with its largest single-day point gain in history. The Dow Jones rose 32.93 points, a 3.2% increase. Investors interpreted the actions as bold and decisive. They were correct. The decision was bold. The question was what had been decided. What had been decided was this. From August 15, 1971 onward, the United States dollar had no definition. It was not a weight of gold. It was not a claim on any physical substance. It was a unit of account created by the Federal Reserve, managed by the Federal Reserve, and valued by the collective willingness of the world to accept it. The dollar became, in the language of economics, a fiat currency, from the Latin word for let it be done. It existed because the government said it existed. The immediate effects were masked by the wage and price freeze. For 90 days, Americans saw stable prices and a rising stock market and believed the new economic policy was working. Gerald Perkins, who had been mildly confused by the Sunday night broadcast, noticed that his grocery bill did not change and concluded that the president had done something helpful. What Nixon had done was apply a tourniquet. The bleeding would resume when the tourniquet was removed. The rest of the world was not as sanguine. Japan's finance minister, Mikio Mizuta, called the Nixon shock the greatest monetary crisis since World War II. The Tokyo Stock Exchange fell 7% in a single day. European markets closed entirely for 2 weeks while central bankers tried to figure out what their currencies were now worth relative to a dollar that had no definition. The French government issued a statement calling the decision a unilateral abrogation of international commitments, diplomatic language for America cheated. In December 1971, the major nations attempted to repair the system. The Smithsonian Agreement, signed at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, established new fixed exchange rates. The dollar was devalued from $35 to $38 per ounce of gold. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. By February 1973, the system had collapsed entirely, and the world's currencies began floating against each other. Their values determined not by gold, not by treaty, but by markets. The system of fixed exchange rates that had provided monetary stability for a generation was replaced by the system of floating rates that still exists today. Currency trading, the buying and selling of money itself, became the largest financial market in the world. As of 2025, approximately $7.5 trillion changes hands in the foreign exchange market every single day. Much of that volume exists because the Smithsonian Agreement failed, which exists because the Bretton Woods system failed, which exists because 15 men in a lodge decided that running out of gold was worse than running out of credibility. The controls were extended, modified, replaced, extended again, and finally abandoned in April 1974. The results were catastrophic. Between 1971 and 1980, the Consumer Price Index rose by 123%. The dollar that Gerald held in August 1971 was worth 45 cents by 1980. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, because the governor had been removed. The Federal Reserve, freed from the golden anchor, increased the money supply to finance government spending. M1, the narrowest measure of the money supply, grew from approximately $228 billion in 1971 to approximately $408 billion in 1980. Food prices doubled. Gasoline went from 36 cents a gallon in 1970 to $1.19 in 1980. Home mortgage rates, which had been 6.5% when Gerald bought his house, reached 18.63% by October 1981. 18.63. If you are paying 5 or 6% on your mortgage today and consider it high, the system that Nixon created in August 1971 produced a rate 3 times higher within a decade. Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman who had warned Nixon that closing the gold window would cause inflation, was still at the Federal Reserve when the inflation arrived. And when it arrived, Burns did something that the forensic record finds deeply instructive. He enabled it. Instead of tightening monetary policy to control the inflation he had predicted, Burns loosened it further. He expanded the money supply because Nixon pressured him to keep the economy growing before the 1972 election. In recordings from the Nixon tapes, declassified and available from the Nixon Presidential Library, Nixon is heard telling Burns that the Fed needed to keep interest rates low. Burns complied. The man who knew the dangers of the system he had just been forced into became the instrument of those dangers. The inflation was finally killed by Burns's successor, Paul Volcker, the same man who had designed the Camp David package. In 1979, Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 20%. 20%. If you borrowed $10,000 for a year, you paid $2,000 in interest alone. The result was the worst recession since the Great Depression at that time. Unemployment reached 10.8%. The automotive industry collapsed. Chrysler required a federal bailout of $1.5 billion to avoid liquidation. Construction stopped. Small businesses closed by the thousands. Gerald Perkins's plant in Dayton cut shifts. His neighbor, a man who had worked the line for 11 years, was laid off and never returned to manufacturing. Gerald himself took a pay cut. The union negotiated a wage reduction in exchange for job preservation. His savings account, which had been earning interest that barely kept up with inflation, was suddenly earning 12%. But the groceries he bought with those savings cost 3 times what they had cost when he opened the account. The interest rate was a number. The grocery bill was reality. Gerald trusted the grocery bill. Volcker endured death threats. Farmers drove tractors to the Federal Reserve building in Washington and blockaded the entrance. Members of Congress called for his removal. He stayed. The inflation stopped. Volcker had used the only tool left to a central bank without a gold anchor: pain. The cure for printing too much money was making money so expensive that people stopped borrowing it. The cure worked, but the disease had been created by the same institution that administered the cure. The inflation was finally killed by Burns's successor, Paul Volcker, the same man who had designed the Camp David package. In 1979, Volcker raised the federal funds rate to 20%. 20%. If you borrowed $10,000 for a year, you paid $2,000 in interest alone. The result was the worst recession since the Great Depression at that time. Unemployment reached 10.8%. The automotive industry collapsed. Chrysler required a federal bailout of $1.5 billion to avoid liquidation. Construction stopped. Small businesses closed by the thousands. Volcker endured death threats. Farmers drove tractors to the Federal Reserve building in Washington and blockaded the entrance. Members of Congress called for his removal. He stayed. The inflation stopped. Volcker had used the only tool left to a central bank without a gold anchor: pain. The cure for printing too much money was making money so expensive that people stopped borrowing it. The cure worked. But the disease had been created by the same institution that administered the cure. This is the structural irony the forensic record insists you understand. The Federal Reserve caused the inflation by expanding the money supply under pressure from Nixon. The Federal Reserve then cured the inflation by inducing the worst recession in 40 years. Both actions were taken by the same institution, operating under the same authority, answerable to nobody who had voted for it. The gold standard had provided an external check on this institution. After 1971, the only check was the character of the people running it. When the character failed, as it did under Burns, inflation arrived. When the character held, as it did under Volcker, the cure was recession. The public bore the cost in both cases. This is not a flaw in the design. This is the design. The petrodollar system, established in 1974 through a secret agreement between Henry Kissinger, William Simon, and the Saudi royal family, replaced gold with oil as the dollar's implicit backing. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all oil exports in dollars and invest surplus revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States provided military protection. The agreement was never signed as a treaty. It was never ratified by Congress. It was negotiated in private and enforced by mutual interest. Every country on earth that wanted to buy oil needed dollars first. The demand for dollars was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by the necessity of purchasing the single most important commodity on the planet. This arrangement is still in effect, though it has weakened. When Saddam Hussein threatened to price Iraqi oil in euros in 2000, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency in 2009, NATO intervened in Libya in 2011. Correlation is not causation. But the forensic record notes the pattern and files it without editorial. The question the forensic record places in front of you is not whether Nixon was right or wrong. The question is mathematical. Since August 15, 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost approximately 87% of its purchasing power, as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. A dollar in 1971 is worth approximately 13 cents today. This is not a secret. It is a published number. It is arithmetic, and it is the direct, documented consequence of removing the gold constraint that prevented the government from creating money faster than the economy created goods. Gerald Perkins's $20 bill, the one he was holding during Bonanza, would need to be worth approximately $154 today to buy the same basket of goods it bought in 1971. Your wages have not kept up. The median household income in 1971, adjusted for inflation, was approximately $63,000 in today's money. The median household income in 2024 was approximately $80,000. That looks like an increase, but the cost of housing has risen 470% since 1971. The cost of healthcare has risen 2,700%. The cost of college education has risen 3,200%. The numbers that rose faster than your income are the numbers that determine whether your children can buy a house, see a doctor, or go to college. This is not inflation caused by supply chains or pandemics or labor markets. This is inflation caused by architecture, the deliberate removal of a constraint that limited how much money a government could create. The constraint was imperfect. The gold standard had its own problems. It was deflationary, it limited growth, it caused banking panics. But it had one feature that the current system does not. It prevented the government from solving every problem by printing a solution. Under the gold standard, the government had to choose between spending and saving. Under the current system, it can do both until it cannot. Gerald Perkins died in 2003. He lived his entire adult life in the post-gold standard economy. He watched his savings account pay 4.5%, then 3%, then 1%, then essentially zero during the years after the 2008 financial crisis. He watched his pension, which had been calculated in 1971 dollars, by less every year. He watched his house appreciate in nominal terms and wondered why everything else seemed to cost more. He did not connect these observations to the Sunday evening in August when the president interrupted Bonanza. He was not supposed to connect them. The entire architecture of the post-1971 system is designed to make the loss gradual enough that you do not notice it happening. But here is the number that will not leave the forensic record. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the assets the Fed owns, which represent the money it has created, was approximately $90 billion in 1971. As of 2025, it is approximately $6.7 trillion. 90 billion to $6.7 trillion. Every dollar of that expansion dilutes the purchasing power of the dollars already in circulation. Your dollars. The ones in your checking account. The ones in your 401k. The ones your employer deposits into your account every 2 weeks. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. government could not print unlimited dollars. Every dollar in circulation was, in theory, backed by gold. If the government printed too many dollars, foreign governments would notice that the dollar was losing value, present their dollars at the Fed, and drain the gold reserve. The gold reserve acted as a governor, a physical limit on how much money the government could create. If you held dollars, you held a claim on gold. If you held a claim on gold, your money could not be inflated away by a government that wanted to spend more than it earned. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the assets the Fed owns, which represent the money it has created, was approximately $90 billion in 1971. As of 2025, it is approximately $6.7 trillion. 90 billion to $6.7 trillion. Every dollar of that expansion dilutes the purchasing power of the dollars already in circulation. Your dollars. The ones in your checking account. The ones in your 401k. The ones your employer deposits into your account every 2 weeks. You are not being taxed by the IRS when this happens. You are being taxed by the Federal Reserve. Economists call this the Cantillon Effect, named after an 18th-century Irish-French economist named Richard Cantillon. The effect is simple. When new money is created, the people who receive it first, banks, large corporations, government contractors, bondholders, benefit because they can spend the new dollars before prices have adjusted. The people who receive it last, wage earners, retirees, savers, are harmed because by the time the new dollars reach them, prices have already risen. The Cantillon effect is not a conspiracy. It is a mathematical consequence of how money enters an economy. It means that every expansion of the money supply is a wealth transfer from people who earn wages to people who own assets. Your rent goes up because your landlord's property value went up. Your landlord's property value went up because the Fed created trillions of dollars that flowed into financial markets and real estate. The chain is documented. The beneficiaries are identifiable. The losers are you. This is the mechanism that Gerald never understood. It is the mechanism that Nixon activated in a lodge in Maryland on a Friday the 13th in August 1971. And it is the mechanism that is operating right now while you listen to this sentence, inside the number that appears when you open your banking app. The gold window has been closed for 54 years. Nobody alive in American public office is proposing to reopen it. The system is permanent. The question is not whether you can change it. The question is whether you understand it well enough to know what it is doing to the number that defines your life. Gerald's granddaughter, who is 31, lives in Kettering, a suburb of Dayton. She works as a dental hygienist. She makes $48,000 a year. She cannot afford to buy a house. The median home price in the Dayton metropolitan area is $220,000. Her grandfather bought his house at a price-to-income ratio of approximately 2 to 1. Her ratio is approximately 4.6 to 1. She has never heard the name Jacques Rueff. She has never heard the words Bretton Woods. She does not know why her paycheck buys less than her grandfather's did. But the forensic record knows. And now, so do you. There is one more number. In March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve created approximately $3 trillion in new money within 3 months. $3 trillion. The entire money supply that existed in 1971, every dollar in every bank, every wallet, every mattress in America, was approximately $685 billion. The Fed created more than 4 times that amount in 12 weeks. It had no choice, or rather, it had the same choice Arthur Burns had in 1972. Print or let the system collapse. Printed. Every time the system approaches a crisis, the answer is the same answer. Create more dollars. And every time more dollars are created, the dollars you already hold become worthless. Gerald's granddaughter has $37,000 in student loan debt from her dental hygienist program. She drives a Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. She has a retirement account through her employer with approximately $11,000 in it. All of it invested in index funds that are denominated in dollars. If those dollars lose purchasing power at the same rate they have since 1971, her $11,000 will buy approximately $1,400 worth of goods by the time she retires. She does not know this. The architecture is designed so that she does not know this. The number in her account goes up. The purchasing power of that number goes down. She sees the number. She does not see the purchasing power. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Nothing should be interpreted as a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any asset.